There are 19 of the 29 buildings that are under private fire watch because the fire alarm systems are defective in the buildings and don't work, that they have to have someone monitoring the buildings at on the clock all the time, monitoring them, which is a major drain on your finances. So the mismanagement of it is actually costing them a lot of money. And like I said earlier, if your units aren't being repaired and they're not habitable, Section 8's not going to pay rent on them. And they're losing rent on about 800 units from what I've read. And I'll link below the articles that I'm talking about so you can see where my sources are. So just the complete mismanagement, probably the high turnover of the staff. So you can see where my sources are. So just the complete mismanagement, probably the high turnover of the staff. And what I'm going to talk about next is the low rents, which go hand in hand, make it fiscally impossible to maintain these buildings. I don't know what the structure of these were. My understanding, Skid Row Housing Trust, they were also developers. So some of these buildings, they had a hand in developing and keeping low income. And so sometimes there's covenants in these kinds of buildings where the city goes, you're not exempt to these rules, you have a different set of rules, but they're low income. And more or less in rent controlled areas like LA City, you can't raise the rents. Again, they're supposed to be low income units. So over time, these units, they can only collect so much money from them. Like I said, they're not even collecting money on some of the units because they're not even habitable and they're so bad, Section 8 won't even pay. So they're not collecting rent money. And even further, there's 2,000 units. Assuming there's one person per unit, which there's probably more, but let's say there's one person per unit. If those tenants fall behind on their rent, which happened across the board during COVID, and that starts to add up, even if the tenant's portion is small, even if it's a little bit amount, if tenants stop paying across 2,000 units, that's also going to hinder your bottom line. And there's ongoing bills associated with this building. There probably is debt on the building, meaning there's probably some sort of mortgage on the building. The building's got to pay taxes. They have to pay registration fees if they're registered with the Rent Control Board. They have to pay the Scet Fees, which is part of the same registration program. It's a different program, but those are fees. They have to pay the utilities on the building, which are often paid by the owner because these are small units that are not likely sub-metered, and those go up. And so, if you're not maintaining the building, like water, if no one's maintaining the building and the water is not separately metered, water goes up so much. And your sewer, which is kind of tied to your water usage, that goes up. So if you have a year where you use a lot of water, your sewer goes up. Even if you've cut back drastically on the water, you have high sewer charges for the next year. I recently discovered this talking to LADWP because I couldn't figure out why someone's water bill was so high for a client of mine. All of that stuff starts to add up. There's trash services that are mandatory. So a lot of these buildings probably have to pay through a contractor. It's not done through the city. They might have to have private trash. That's expensive, and that goes up pretty much every year. Pest control services. These buildings probably have pest control services. And because they're in Skid Row, they're high risk of having ongoing pest problems given the area. Just the fact that all of this stuff was happening. Another thing that came up was that the units, part of the problem with the units is there'd be in-unit fires. So the homeless, either from doing drugs or some sort of hoarding issue or just mental health, these units were being set on fire and they didn't have the money to fix the units. The unit's now uninhabitable. They're not collecting rent on. And the person is probably back on the street, hopefully rehoused somewhere. But that's another huge problem is fires. That is very, very common. If you're here in LA, you've seen them, you know about them. There's almost a fire every single day in LA as the result of some sort of homeless encampment. And so my last prong about this is the lack of ongoing services. You have to understand when you have low-income housing, a lot of it is that these individuals haven't been housed for a very long time, haven't been gainfully employed, have been living on the streets, and haven't had ongoing services for their addiction or their mental health. I've seen this so many times where nonprofits push and push and push to get tenants vouchers. They push and push and push to get them subsidies. They move them an apartment and then they drop them. And there's just not enough caseworkers to follow up, to see them, to make sure, are you taking your medication? Are you going to these services? Are you, you getting the help that you need? Are you looking for employment? Like once they house them, it's like, okay, I don't have to worry about it. And if they're subsidized, a lot of the times the tenants have absolutely no rent to pay and they have some sort of general relief. So they're able to get around town and they're able to eat. So with that, they're wholly on their own. They have some money to get around with, but they have really no other responsibility. So that's where if they're not being checked in on, if no one's, looking out for them, they tend to fall into the same patterns that got them homeless. They didn't take their meds. They are re-exposed to alcohol or drugs, which we as a country are having a fentanyl crisis. And a lot of the homeless deaths are directly linked to fentanyl. In the news, right before the trust went into receivership, 3 people had died from fentanyl overdoses in one of the buildings, like a few days before it went into receivership.
Well, breaking news in downtown LA where 3 people were found dead from possible drug overdoses.
Desmond Shaw is live in SkyCal right now with more on the situation down there.
Ross and Leslie, we're in the heart of Skid Row here, Wall Street between 6th and 7th. You see LAPD here investigating. Sadly, an all too common occurrence. We understand it was 3 people that have died from fentanyl overdose today here on Skid Row. Most likely some homeless folks down in the area. So LAPD down here investigating. We've been seeing them talking to a couple of witnesses, seeing if they can get any more information on the people that sadly have lost their lives today here on Skid Row. So the investigation just now getting underway. 3 people dead of a drug overdose here in downtown.
Once people are housed in these units, that mission's not done. It's not like, okay, that's fine. People get housed all the time and they lose housing all the time and they get evicted. They get evicted for, the hoarding problem. They get evicted for acting erratic or, being verbally or physically abusive to other tenants, other occupants and properties. Sometimes they get evicted for not paying rent, but a lot of it has to do with behavioral issues. And those issues, a lot of the times out of their control. I mean, for instance, if you're, you have some sort of addiction, it takes a lot to overcome the addiction. And a lot of people have to go to ongoing meetings to make sure that, like Alcoholics Anonymous. So you can imagine if someone who's homeless and hasn't really had any form of support structure, how highly likely it is they're going to get back on the street. Even if they are housed, even if they have an apartment, they don't have the means or the ability or the understanding of how to be responsible and keep it. And that's something that even people who aren't homeless struggle with. I really think it's the management. They probably had really unstable management. They probably didn't have long-term staff who had a feel or got familiar with the building. There's probably high turnover. They had low rents or weren't collecting rents, so their cash flow was completely suffering. And then they had a lack of ongoing services to the tenants once they were housed. That resulted in a lot of tenants relapsing or turning to behaviors or acts that, at one point had them on the streets. The news on it is there's a new receiver. I forget his name. I talked about it in my newsletter, which I'm going to shamelessly plug. I have a newsletter. I give updates about usually California and LA law pertaining to real estate, sometimes national things if it's relevant. And then I just, have a general newsletter with information. So feel free to subscribe. The link will be below. It's free. Also, if you liked this video, like and subscribe if you felt it was helpful. If you liked the content in it, drop a comment if there's other kind of content or research that you suggest that I do a video on. I struggle with having video ideas, but I was really, really passionate about this because it goes to show just because you have a nonprofit behind something doesn't necessarily mean that that nonprofit has the resources or the structure to keep things going. So it's not necessarily the answer is that you're just going to give it to a nonprofit and that will be resolved. It takes a lot to deal with property management. It takes a lot to deal with various aspects of a person's life that rendered them on the street. And while some people think that it's, due to the high cost of rent, which that's a whole other conversation, but a lot of it has to do with just the lack of ongoing services available to high risk individuals who again have addiction or mental illness that sometimes they don't have the ability or the self-discipline to control and regulate and need help. And so just putting them in housing is not the answer. So it'd be interesting to see what happens with this new receiver. I get any updates, I will talk about it in my newsletter and do a little link on it. But thanks for checking out this video, even though I'm out of focus and it's like driving me nuts. Thanks. I'll talk to you next time.